talking about the freedom of doctors and patients to make decisions as is best for the patient after that consultation is critical. It's essential, an essential component to a medical system that actually provides top quality care. Nan Hayworth is a former Congresswoman for the 19th Congressional District of New York, a medical doctor herself, and she joins us now to pick up this conversation that I think we need to underscore in the current climate. Nan, welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. It's always great to talk with you.
Great to talk with my most brilliant millennial colleague, Jimmy, and also to follow, indeed, such august guests as former Governor Schwarzenegger and, of course, our president.
I chuckle at all of that. Nan Hayworth, including the brilliant part. I mean, I did tell you to call me millennial genius, so you didn't get exactly the right language, but close enough. I'll throw a 10 your way after the interview. And yeah, do you like that? The little entertainment.
Text in the mail. Yeah.
Excellent. Yes, indeed. It will be in the mail. It's not there yet, but it'll be a little later. I appreciate it.
That's what they all say, Jimmy.
Did you enjoy the humor there too before we brought you on?
I did.
We like to have fun here. So
absolutely. And you know your point, the ad, of course, that preceded the president and Governor Schwarzenegger. It says much. I mean, you're teaching with humor, but we have seen in all too many ways, including under the auspices of a great president who really seeks to lift barriers, how government intervention can cause unfortunately, lots of collateral problems, unintentionally, but for real.
Oh, make no mistake about it. That is for darn sure. I want to start off here, as I think we should, on Free to Choose Friday, by playing another clip of the great late Milton Friedman. This is from 1999, Dr. Friedman on with Peter Robinson on Uncommon Knowledge, and he got into a discussion about the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the chief regulatory authority when it comes to approving prescription drugs, and the free market. Rather, I should say, the FDA versus the free market. Take a listen to this.
Thalidomide. Mm-hmm. Thalidomide, marketed
everybody's favorite example.
Well, I may be leading with my chin on this one, but I'm going to lead with it anyway. 50s and 60s, it is marketed in Europe as a drug to help women get through the nausea that they sometimes experience during pregnancy. The Food and Drug Administration said it had been inadequately tested in the United States and forbade it to be marketed in this country, with the result that thousands of children were born with horrible birth defects in Europe to mothers who had used thalidomide, but that didn't happen to American children because the FDA had intervened and kept that drug off the market. Thank God for the FDA, right?
Wrong.
All right, why?
This is a case in which they did save lives. This was a good case. But I suppose they are equally slow in adopting a drug which turns out to be very good and very beneficial. How do you ever see the lives that are lost because of that? You're an FBA official.
Right.
You have a question of whether to approve or disapprove a new drug. If you approve it, and it turns out to be a bad drug like thalidomide, you're in the soup. Your name's going to be on every front
Cost me
page.
my job. I get hauled up to
Right.
Congress to testify. Right.
On the other hand, if you disapprove it, but it turns out to be good, well, then later on you approve it 4 or 5 years later. Nobody is going to complain about the fact that you didn't prove it earlier, except those greedy pharmaceutical companies that want to make profits at the expense of the public, as the saying as everybody will say. And so the result is that the pressure on the FDA is always to be late in approving. And there is enormous evidence that they have caused more deaths by their late approvals than they have saved by their early approvals.
21 years ago, the wisdom of Milton Friedman. Your thoughts, Dr. Nan Hayworth?
What a wonderful segment, Jimmy, and semi-peripherally, it brings to mind that if only children in school were taught Milton Friedman instead of not being, because trying to persuade adults of these eminently sensible principles once they have been indoctrinated makes it all that much harder. But with regard to the FDA and the question at hand, which is, what of the hidden lives lost by delay of life-saving therapies, point well taken. And Jimmy, you've asked the question about a safety standard versus a safety plus efficacy standard.
Right.
And I think you can look at the history of medications that have been approved in this country, and certainly any that have been dramatic life-saving medications that were significantly delayed to market. I don't think that, in fairness, I don't think that there are any necessarily glaring examples of that, because our life-saving armamentarium consists largely of medications that were, whose benefits were readily demonstrable and they were readily approved. These days, in this era, we're a bit more at the margins in terms of the numbers, but nonetheless, every life saved is precious. So I would gladly, and I have experience in the pharma industry, working with the pharma industry, I would gladly substitute in a safety standard. And certainly efficacy is a valuable principle, but and highly valuable. Obviously, it's very important because there are also risks to taking medications. Clearly, that's part of the safety issue, but often you don't know the entire safety picture. In fact, you never do until a medication or an intervention, biologic or device, gets into broad use in the population. But today, because we have the opportunity to finally target interventions at very small select groups within the population, we tailor medicine, personalized precision medicine. It becomes all the more important for clinicians to have that full armamentarium, and there have certainly been some very poignant arguments, especially conspicuously concerning muscular dystrophy. There was a huge fight about a genetic intervention that was tested, and it didn't satisfy the FDA as to numbers, but it certainly seemed as though at least one subset of the muscular dystrophy population could benefit significantly from this intervention. Small numbers, but a profound impact. So I would agree that a safety consideration should be first and foremost, and let the marketplace do much more in terms of efficacy.
Well, and Nan, one thing that comes to my mind is Milton Friedman also made the point that we don't know what drugs were not approved that might have saved lives over the decades. Earlier, I played a clip from 1978, Friedman having these very same warnings. And as Dr. Durrell pointed out, beta blockers have been used for heart conditions and whatnot since then. And that's something that Friedman was saying. Doctors are saying this could be done, but they haven't been approved by the FDA. And you think, okay, how many drugs were denied over the years that could well have actually been able to address some of these issues? And then also Dr. Singer pointed out from the Cato Institute, he pointed out that if you trust patients or doctors to make decisions for off-label use of a particular drug, why wait until that point when you've tested efficacy for one use, but you're saying, hey, if you could find it effective for another use, then we give the doctor latitude with the patient.
The points are entirely taken. Looking at knowing what I know about the practice of medicine and the demographics of disease, I'm quite honestly not able to think of necessarily a glaring example in which we say, my God, we could have saved 15,000 patients with XYZ if it hadn't taken 3 years to get this to market. Usually, something that is, if there is a tremendous need and there's a promising therapy, even old, hidebound FDA has typically over the years, I think for the most part, we've been able to get things out to market reasonably well. But that doesn't mean that we can't do a lot better. It doesn't, and the FDA certainly, as I say, in this era in which we're going to have smaller numbers of patients who can benefit dramatically from certain interventions, we do need to rethink the way they do things. And in fact, Scott Gottlieb, when he was the FDA administrator, did think differently and did institute reforms to emphasize more in the way of real-world evidence, to speed and streamline data collection, analysis, and decision-making. And those are things that very much need to be done. Apropos specifically, though, of the off-label use of medications and urgent need, we may indeed right now, with COVID-19, be seeing a situation in which thousands of Americans might be able to benefit from an intervention that has yet to be endorsed by the FDA, and that, of course, is hydroxychloroquine. We don't know yet for sure. We are glad that clinicians have legal access in their formularies to off-label use of hydroxychloroquine. But as we all know, there's been a lot of cross currents and a lot of frowning by respected experts on the innovative use of by clinicians of hydroxychloroquine early in the course of COVID-19, not once somebody's in the hospital, but early on.
Well,
and that actually is like the ultimate right to try right now.
Well, and similarly, though, you got remdesivir, which Dr. Durrell has been a strong advocate of, and now Dr. Fauci said, hey, I want to let people know that this one is holding promise. And by the way, Dr. Durrell says he's been, for patients that he's not worried about the risk profile, they've been giving hydroxychloroquine automatically, but he's been noticing real success with remdesivir. The point is that medical providers should be able to have the latitude to make decisions for their patients in consultation with the patients saying, sure, let's go ahead and try this. I've been in situations where I've been dealing with a condition and the doctor says, hey, here's an off-label use for this particular drug. We think it could work. Lo and behold, in my particular circumstance of something, it worked out. But one thing that you often get, if you say, let's go back to the safety standard, let's just focus on the idea of safety or limit the role of the Food and Drug Administration in providing the authorization for a particular drug, Nan Hayworth. This kind of gets to a philosophical question in some respect, but it's the idea of, well, then won't people die if you don't have the government making these particular judgments to screen it out and ensure that there is a protection for particular prescription drugs that people may get? Basically, hey, the government's going to be able to provide better protection than doctors will for their patients. So what do you make of that argument, the idea of more dangerous situations if the FDA doesn't have this expansive role?
I think there is, as in all things, there is a balance that we need to seek. We know that, and I have all faith in markets, and indeed little faith in government. I mean, I have absolutely no faith, obviously, in government overreach. So, but where do we define that line? The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, did arise because there actually was a need to protect the public from adulterated products. There was there was an authority to which we did seek to turn. Now that was that was 100 plus years ago. The public did not have access to information as we do now. So people could exist in a state of profound ignorance. And indeed, you could argue that certainly about a lot of labor laws that were instituted in a very different era when we had far less access, far less transparency, right? It was that the marketplace of information was a very different thing. But when intelligent people have access to information, when intelligent clinicians have access to information, if we trust those in industry to have the best interests of America's patients at heart, and certainly my experience in industry that did not contradict that, then certainly we can put more trust in the markets than we might have been able to do 120 years ago.
That's a good point.
And I think that's an argument to be made.
Dr. Nan Hayworth, our guest, ophthalmologist and former Congresswoman for the 19th Congressional District in New York. Going off that point, I mean, not only is there more information for people to access and for doctors to be able to access, but you also have a situation where back in the day, when the FDA went into effect originally, it was to provide for safety specifically. And then it has grown much more into this more expansive role about efficacy. And I think that's important to keep in mind in this whole discussion. But also I think it's important to recognize that the profit motive, it gets... You know, people say, oh, greed, it's terrible and people are doing greedy things. I don't think that self-interest and greed are the same thing. And a company that is motivated by self-interest in the market will be responsive to any concerns that may come about, in that their reputations would be sullied if people were going to be dying because of a particular medication that would be provided and result in death. You know, the profit motive is a protective mechanism.
No, profit is an unalloyed good when honestly earned. What happens, you know, the point I always make to folks is, look, greed and self-interest are both endemic to the human condition. But greed is empowered by government. The fundamental difference between government and enterprise and markets is that government has the force of arms. And whatever agency of government you're talking about, ultimately, they have powerful coercive force that marketplace participants do not. And it can be abused, and it is abused. And certainly Big Pharma has certain advantages that they have sought to press because, again, human beings are opportunistic. You know, so that's why, you know, markets provide that dynamic balance of self-interest on the part of all parties. Government can distort that. So there is every reason to be skeptical of government, if not even more skeptical. So yes, do we rely on the folks at the FDA and at the CDC to do their jobs and do that with incredible dedication? We do. But look what happened. Look what happened with the test for COVID-19, and I do not blame President Trump for this in the slightest, because at some point you have to have some faith in your agencies, and God knows the man has more than enough to do than to micromanage the CDC. But what did they do? They manufactured the test themselves, and
the only one allowed.
They didn't even follow their own standards.
Yeah. And it was the only test that was allowed, too, in the United States at the time.
Exactly.
And that's an important point. The CDC had a defective and inefficient test that was the only one they permitted in the beginning of this pandemic, and that certainly is something we need to keep in mind as far as the notion of trusting government in these areas. And Nan Hayworth, I want to ask you about right to try in just a moment, but I do want to play real quick one more clip of Milton Friedman in Cut 3 when he gets into the discussion of, in his view, abolishing the FDA, but particularly listen to how he frames it.
So your view is abolish the FDA.
Absolutely.
And what comes up
What
in
comes
its
up
place?
is it's in the self-interest of pharmaceutical companies not to have these bad things. Do you think the manufacturer of thalidomide made a profit out of thalidomide or lost?
I see. Okay.
And you have to have, people should be responsible for harm that they do. It should have been possible.
So tort law takes care of a lot of this.
Absolutely.
All right. If Lilly or Merck or somebody else comes up with a drug that does me harm, I go after them. I join a class action with everybody else who's taken that pill, and we sue them for billions of dollars and wipe out their shareholders' equity.
Absolutely. And
seeing that they have every interest to be extremely rigorous in testing that drug before they make it available.
Now, neither of us in this discussion is talking about abolishing the FDA, but I do think that what Friedman was saying is very apropos of this discussion as far as what would happen otherwise. I want to talk for a minute about right to try, this idea that if there is a life-saving medication that's just being tested, going through the approval process, those kinds of things, and you want to try it, that you should be able to do so. We had right to try legislation that President Trump signed into law, but still, as I understand it, and Dr. Jeffrey Singer talked talked about it earlier, you still have to show that you've exhausted all the other options before you get to this particular point. Tell us your thoughts, Dr. Nan Hayworth, on the right to try concept and the law that was passed.
Well, that's what happens when the precautionary principle is still very highly represented, sort of hypertrophic, especially among American lawmakers and especially among those who are inclined to empower the state, which tends to be on the Democratic side. Fascinatingly enough, obviously, if any nation would be poised to punish malefactors in markets and industry, it would be the United States. And indeed we are, because we have the most litigious society in the world. So we have the double whammy of the threat of litigation, the threat of liability, and that is a powerful fear inducer among practitioners for understandable reasons. So that's, you combine the precautionary principle with a litigious society, and you kind of have the worst of both worlds when it comes to actually trying to innovate in desperate situations, right? Because you've got, a government that even honoring the principle of, but if there's nothing else, right, please let them try anything that might say whatever it is, and let them indemnify the folks who are doing this. There's obviously to have to exhaust every other possibility takes away significant discretion from clinicians. And indeed, the right to try law is wonderful in principle. And kudos to President Trump for common sense. I mean, it just literally is compassion and common sense embodied in law for people who are desperate. But that's a reason why it's not more broadly applied.
No, sure.
And it should be modified.
But it is a very critical point to keep in mind that if you, it's so interesting that, look, there are folks on the left who favor physician-assisted suicide, for example. Yet they do not want people to try certain medications that might save their lives because they're worried that they might lose their lives or something. I don't understand that particular contradiction where you're like, sure, go ahead, do physician-suicide, but when it comes to trying a drug that might save your life that the FDA hasn't said, sure, this is all good with us, that's a different story in their mind. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I think it so much of it, Jimmy, has to do with the fun. As phenomena do in this country and in our government. I mean, this is a profound cause of the struggle we have between the more libertarian among us and those who are more authoritarian. They fundamentally don't trust individuals to be capable of making these decisions. Obviously, I guess, other than for assisted suicide, which is another topic entirely. But fundamentally, there is always the assumption that people are going to be either on the patient side too weak, too vulnerable, not capable of making these decisions without the state stepping in prudentially, and on the provider side, from the individual practitioner to industry, a mistrust that somehow there won't be some kind of manipulation or malefaction in some way, profit motive, which God forbid, there should be a profit motive, that will impair the relationship on that side and bias things toward harm. And that's the mindset. If you have that kind of mindset, it's a terrible way to live, and it's the antithesis of what Milton Friedman represented, which was people who are intelligent and empowered and capable and seeking that agency and embracing it and taking responsibility for the results of their decisions. And that is a cultural phenomenon that we are losing in this country. We have generations now indoctrinated in its antithesis.
Dr. Nan Hayworth, just a couple more questions for you. And everything that you were just saying resonated with me in terms of a question that I've asked a number of different guests, including earlier Dr. Durrell, and especially in this case in the medical context. After this crisis has abated, what lesson do you hope the American people will get, and which do you think they will get? Which is the one, government needs to step it up. It hasn't done enough. It needs to provide for more Medicare for all, so on and so forth. Government needs to do more because we cannot trust the private sector to address these issues, versus the other option, the other lesson, which is we cannot rely on government, whether in crisis or not in crisis, to provide for the needs of the people. And by the way, that maybe add on to that the idea that government shouldn't do it. But the first part of the question is the first part of number 2 is the key one, I think, which is the idea that we cannot rely upon government. So the question to you is about relying on government more, relying on government less. What do you think is the lesson people will learn and should learn from this?
And that question demonstrates why you are the millennial genius, Jimmy, because that is eternal.
Oh gosh, do I need to send you another 10, 20? I don't know. I haven't concluded yet how much I'm going to owe you now.
Yeah, well, if you got a $5, I could use that. But,
all right, keep that in mind.
I ran out of change.
Okay.
But no, that is at the crux of where we how we recover, Jimmy. What nation we will be as we emerge from this epochal crisis, which is literally, it's of the magnitude of a World War II plus 1918 pandemic plus Great Depression, all abruptly happening at the same time. And you're seeing it played out. You're seeing it played out in the Michigan State Capitol. You're seeing it played out in various other states that have elements of their citizenry who feel unfairly imposed upon by overreaching government, and they don't feel trusted with their own common sense. We see it in the state of South Dakota in the positive way. Governor Nome in her state has a citizenry who have been capable of conducting themselves in a way that has thus far, minimized the impact of COVID-19 on their population. This is, I think, we're going to remain, in my opinion, Jimmy, we're going to remain a divided nation, because I think people are going to see in this whatever they want to see in it, depending, what's going to, obviously, we're going to see how these early opening states do in the next few days and weeks. Georgia, South Carolina, Colorado. Colorado doesn't get a lot of play in the mainstream media because Jared Polis is Democratic governor, but he's opening up his state on the early side as well. So if they do well, and there's evidence to show, T.J. Rogers of Cypress Semiconductor, founder of Cypress Semiconductor, very smart guy, mapped out death rates at 21 days past first death in states and countries around the world, correlated against versus the time to lockdown, whether it was, 5 days before the first death or, 30 days after the first death, whatever it was, could not find a correlation, interestingly enough. His feeling being lockdowns, his conclusion, that is, being that lockdowns actually are not the key here. Maybe in areas of urban concentration like New York, could be, stands to reason, makes sense. But I think we are going to see in a lot of these blue states that government is failing. New York City is a dumpster fire. So we're going to have plenty to argue about in the months to come.
And make no mistake.
Where I fall down on this.
Yeah,
but,
well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And make no mistake, we need to be looking more towards how to unleash the unlimited potential of each and every individual, of private sector innovation, of doctor-patient freedom. I mean, those are the key lessons that we all need to learn, to be sure. And I do want to say that you're right, that Jared Polis, being as I'm broadcasting from Colorado, he's my governor.
Yeah,
Governor
exactly,
Polis is better than a heck of a lot of other Democrats, but at the same time, there are a lot of local governments in counties that are saying we're extending this a couple of weeks, maybe it will go longer, what have you. But certainly the media doesn't talk about Polis's role, but I'm in a county now where it's been extended by local authorities, unelected bureaucrats, by the way. But nevertheless, I digress, as they say. Former Congresswoman Nan Hayworth. Yes, please.
Oh, just very quickly, one universal conclusion that we should all draw is that profligate government in times of peace does us harm. We should be planning and saving and not instituting debt accumulation when we can plan ahead for the future. And that is the Democrats' approach. The Republicans directly have opposed that kind of government spending. And that is something that universally should be accepted at the end of this. That much I will definitely say.
I agree. And one other point that I think is critical to make is that, look, government has been cutting away the red tape in state after state and at the federal level in terms of some of these drug approvals or the tests approving antibody tests and so forth. They've been cutting away the restrictions on physicians being able to practice across state lines and so forth. Why, just in a crisis that is common sense, that we should just say, hey, you're doing this now to streamline a quality of care in the crisis situation. Why not make that a regular occurrence, even in a normal year?
Right, absolutely. No, I think many arguments are to be made in that way. You know, there's government that's the right size. We don't want anarchy. We do need good government, but you know, defining good government means restrained government. You know, and it means it means yes that the power, you know, and it's up to folks like us to make sure that folks are deriving the right lessons. But you know, the power, especially in the age of information, the power of knowledgeable citizens in the marketplace applying their talents to solve problems and being accountable for what they do, because that's also the information age, means that we can be more powerful, more independent, and actually do better, much better.
A quote comes to mind. We've been sharing Founding Father quotes, and a quote comes to mind of James Madison, who said, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." I think I got almost verbatim, maybe verbatim, the quote from James Madison, but it is so profound and important. Dr. Nan Hayworth, ophthalmologist, former Congresswoman for New York's 19th Congressional District. Always great to talk with you. We could go on for much longer, but I appreciate your time here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for joining us on a Free to Choose Friday.
Always a privilege. Thanks, Jimmy.
The privilege is all mine. Thank you. Again, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.